Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Good morning.
Welcome to Primetime, the library, celebrating learning beyond the classroom, experiences and accomplishments of the faculty, students, and staff. Is what Primetime is all about. It's a collaborative project between the Friends of the Library, faculty development, and many other offices on campus. Keep an eye on the library webpage for more great presentations as they are scheduled. One of these presentations could be you. Contact Keith Brooks if you are interested in presenting. If you missed a presentation, most are recorded. You can review it online at VU Digital Library, found on the library website. Our next prime time will be Tuesday, March 11th, when Jenny Nadala and Liz LeGrand present an international study abroad spotlight entitled Adventures in Spain, the Events of the Mountaintop. Today we welcome Dr. Nancy Brule from Communication Studies as she presents Raise Up a Child in the Way They Should Go, applying Stigma Management Communication Theory to parents abused by their adolescents. Let's welcome Nancy.
Thank you. My co-author on this paper is actually my daughter, Jessica Eckstein. So her and I have been working on this paper. It's now in the form ready to be sent off to a theory journal that specializes in family theories with that interdisciplinary approach. So we're very excited about this. One of the areas that and welcome to all of you, and I have a number of our lab students. This is what they're going to be doing at conference in about 3 weeks. So we're very excited for our comm students with the research they've been doing. One of the things I like to begin with is, I get to use this thing though, this works. Which one? Not on there. Uh-oh. Good monkey with technology, Nancy. I'm not good at it. Okay. When we look at this idea of the belief system that when we grow up and when we have families, what do we expect a family to be? We expect a family to be a happy family where the kids are respectful of their parents. They may have a few little conflicts here and there. But the social narrative is, as we look at our society, is that good children equals good parents. And oftentimes what happens, though, is when we consider that, we do not take into consideration some of the environmental stressors that might take place. We have to deal with some of the identities of what parents are going through as they're struggling with children who are hard to raise. And a lot of times when people don't meet the societal norms of what parenting and what their children should be like and what their children should act like, what happens is that we begin to get this idea of stigma, being you are a bad parent. So what I'm going to do today is I'm talking about the Goffman's stigma theory, just in a very brief way, and then we're going to look at Meisenbach's Stigma Management Communication Theory, and then we're going to apply it in the context of adolescents who are abused by their parents. This is my area of research. When we look at adolescents who are abused by parents, we are looking at a very unique form of intimate violence that takes place. One reason because nobody really knows about adolescents who are abusing their parents because parents don't talk about it. Not only are they stigmatized, they are very much silenced. And when we look at this model, we see why the stigma silences these types of parents. A lot of times people will just say, and you hear this in the Christian areas a lot, is this, well, they just need to, tough love or, kick the child out of the home or do whatever the case may be. But in one sense, that may seem simplistic and easy to do, but in the other sense, it really isn't, because what people don't realize is that in this unique form of domestic violence is that parents are legally and morally responsible for their children. If I would kick my child out if he was abusing me and I put him out on the street or just abandon him, whatever the case may be, I would be found guilty of child neglect or child endangerment or whatever the case may be. So this is a very unique type of bind that a lot of times parents find themselves in when they're dealing with some of these adolescents. And what happens that when you have this combination then, because parents are if you're a parent, how many of you are parents? Good, not many of you. No, I have a lot of students here. Okay. All right. But this combination, what happens is that interpersonally as a parent, I begin to think about who I am and how good of a parent I am, and this is my social identity. And as much as we would like or not to do it, we live through our children. Not that we live through them in what they do, but we live through them in whether or not we are successful as parents. And so if you are bad, based on the social, cultural, normative narrative, if you are a poor child, then you must be a bad parent, because we buy into this idea that children equal parents or parents equal children. And there's also this idea of the cultural vulnerability. We do not have a lot of, our society, our culture does not have a lot of patience with parents who are raising high-risk, difficult children to raise. Again, mainly I would argue because of lack of knowledge possibly, but what happens then is that parents become stigmatized, and what results then in that is that we have what we call a veil of silence. Is that parents don't want to talk about what's going on in their lives because they're going to be stigmatized. People really don't, people are quick to judge, and they will talk about, well, you're just a bad parent, or why don't they do that, why don't they do this, and you hear this from parents who are abused by their adolescents all the time. And what happens is that we create this veil of silence or this veil of denial, so you have a very underreported type of intimate violence that goes even deeper underground for fear of stigmatization, being stigmatized as a bad parent. So these are the three areas that we'll be looking at. First thing I want to talk about very quickly is this idea of what is adolescent to parent abuse. Whenever I present on this area of my research, I always have to repeat it because people don't really get it. They think I'm saying parents who abuse their adolescents. But we're looking at adolescents who are under a minor age who physically, emotionally, and verbally abuse their parents in a number of different ways. My sample comes from 39 parents who had the requirement or the criteria was they had to be both, or three, they had to be verbally, emotionally, and physically abused in order to meet the requirements for my study. If they only were physically abused and not emotionally abused, they didn't qualify. They were all verbally abused, but that was where it stopped. They didn't qualify because we know verbal abuse is a precursor to physical and emotional abuse. So what happens is that we have this idea of double victimization that parents go through. So we talked about that. And so when we look at this idea of what stigma is, or the stigma theory in a nutshell, we know that stigma's function is the creation and maintenance of normative standards. Stigma can actually be a healthy thing for societies, because in order to maintain a status quo of what we consider acceptable behavior. Unfortunately, that stigma often will evolve as society evolves, well, or fortunately, depending on what the issues are. And so stigma's function, it plays a very important role, and it's a very important function. It creates this attitude of it's an us versus them. So either I am an abused parent or I am not an abused parent. Either I'm a good parent or I'm not a good parent. And so it really has, stigma really has a polarizing effect on a number of different issues, but especially when we talk about adolescents who are abusing their parents. We know there's three types of stigma that occur, and actually adolescents, teens who are abused by their parents who are abused by their adolescents actually experience all three of these. However, as you look into the interviews and the reports and the stories that the parents give, what you see is that a lot of times it's considered more of a moral stigma than anything else, because they have failed to reach this societal norm of how they are supposed to raise their parents and much of their children, and much of that is biblically based, whether they're Christians or not. We expect a child to grow up the way that we raise them, the train the way they should go, and when they're old, they will not depart from it. And whether you're a Christian or not, people will buy into that idea of that's the way it should happen. So parents often feel like they have failed morally when their children don't meet the criteria of being a happy family or a normal child or abusing them or whatever the case may be. So what happens is that they achieve a stigma. This stigma of parents is achieved either through their own conduct, how they act to it, how they respond to it, but also with their own belief. Because what happens many times, although some stigmatized groups will fight against the stigma, what we find with adolescents who are abusing their parents, those types of parents, is that they don't fight against the stigma. They actually accept the narrative that culture is telling them that you are a bad parent because your child is abusing you. And so what happens there is that they then buy into this stigma. You are right, I am a bad parent. And then that begins to affect many different areas of their lives regarding self-esteem and things such as this. So the question becomes, for my daughter and I, became, how do they overcome the stigma? In order to educate and teach and to get this message out, we have to have parents who are willing not to accept that stigma. And that becomes very difficult to do. I had an interview set up with People magazine, and we had looked for a number of different families, and I finally had tracked down 3 of the families that I had interviewed who were willing to share about their experience. And so this was going to be, and it was really exciting at the time because this was it's such an understudied, underreported. But when it came down to it, even though they were going to protect the names and things such as that, some of the children in the family, not the abusive children, but some of the siblings, said, if you ever do this, I'll change my name, I'll disown you, whatever the case may be, because of the stigma. And so therefore, the very thing that could have helped alleviate the stigma was put and reinforced, and then they couldn't run the article after they had it written. So all of this type of things come into play. And unfortunately, we know in our society that being an abuse victim is a stigma, especially if you're an adult, because as an adult we say, why can't you just leave the situation, right? Why did you marry that person, whatever the case may be. But they're also looked at as a poor parent. So this way, adolescents who are abused by or parents who are abused by their adolescents are, one, they're an abuse victim with the stigma that goes along with that, and then the second idea that they are also a poor parent. And so what happens is that they become two types of individuals. Parents will make a decision to choose to be either, according to the stigma theory, a discredited individual, meaning I am a parent who is being abused by my adolescents. Therefore, I am a discredited individual. I have a stigma. However, and so those are the parents who let it be known, whether that be through legal means, whether that be through court-ordered counseling, whether that be through sharing with someone, seeking counseling, whatever the case may be. They have put it out there and then they become discredited. However, we have discreditable individuals or discreditable parents, those parents who refuse to acknowledge they are being abused for fear of being stigmatized. And so if it would ever come out, they seek to hide their experience because they don't want to be known as a parent or a bad parent, because again, that's who they are, that's their identity. And it becomes this vicious circle that goes around and around and around, all because of the role of stigma in this. So Meisenbach came up with I want to make sure we have time for lots of questions. So Meisenbach came up with this Stigma Management Communication Strategy. And it's a newer model. Back in 2010 is when this article came out. And as I was looking through and reading it, it just began to make so much sense when I began to look at it and apply it to some of the narratives and the interviews that my parents had done and had gone through. And so what this model does, it says, here's how people manage stigma. And here's how it's effective, basically, or not effective. And it's not at the point now where it's projecting what to do, but even by presenting the 4 domains of this theory, or model, you'll see where we can begin to make a change in the actual preventing of stigmatization and getting people to go ahead and speak out. So, what I did was, this is this quadrant of the model, okay? Her quadrant says, accepting stigma and applying to the self. Okay, so that's that one quadrant. Here's how some people deal with the stigma. They accept the stigma or they apply it to themselves. I put this with qualitative research like you do, oftentimes you'll put exemplars as a representative for what that area is about. So this one says, I'm a bad parent. Parents who fall into this quadrant use some different communication strategies to be able to deal with the stigma. I want to make sure I have the right thing here. Okay? So the first category is called accepting. When we look at this category, this is when individuals not only acknowledge the understanding of the stigma, but they also acknowledge that, yes, this stigma applies to me. All right? So that's one way that they do it, and they accept it. So acceptance of this, oftentimes of adolescent parent abuse, really many times comes at the point where the parent no longer has any energy to fight or to go through it anymore. They get to a point, adolescent to parent abuse usually occurs between the ages of 10 through 18. Research shows that once they turn 18, parents are no longer legally responsible, so they can actually kick them out of the house. And a lot of times that's where you see the abuse stop. But when we look at this, so you figure from age 10, 11 till 18, that's 7 years of this. And usually by the year 5 is where you start, these kids are usually getting to be 10, 11, 11th grade, is where you begin to see parents being very much exhausted about what they can and can no longer handle. Now realize you're talking about 7 years of dealing with a situation that is stigmatized. It's not a situation where you can come out and say, I need help, even though they do try to get help. It's not a situation where you have a social support network, because there's none out there, very few out there, and the ones that are out there are pretty interesting to read. But this whole idea of this passive acceptance, you know what, there's nothing that I can do anymore. I'm not going to argue with anybody about this situation. I'm not going to argue with my parents, my grandparents, whatever the case may be. I'm simply going to accept it. And so this is called passive acceptance. Usually at this stage, parents have very low self-esteem. Very low self-esteem. They have severe depression, and they experience isolation. They'll stop going places. They quit going places as families. They totally isolate themselves in the home because of what they're going through. Another communicative strategy is disclosure through activism is one response to this, that yes, I am an abused parent. But what happens is that many times with this is that parents will want to talk about it. They will try to educate others. But because of the negative response they get from people, like someone may say, and oftentimes parents will not put themselves as the parent. There's a parent who's being abused by her son, and here's what's happened. And the other person will go, well, they just need to crack that kid up the head and throw him against the wall, which is a type of comment these parents get all the time. Right then what happens is that they're trying to educate, but they automatically shut the parent down. They no longer will try to educate along that way. It's possible sometimes that they seek this, they try to educate themselves. They'll go to counselors. The average number of counselors people go to is 9 is the average. Some go up to 16, and almost all of them will say, there's nothing. There's nothing. Realizing that one child out of their 3.4 children are being abusive. They'll apologize. This one to me is actually the next area of study that I'm going to do, because it really speaks to me, this idea of ambiguous loss. One of the reports is that parents who are abused and they feel like it's their fault. I'm a bad parent, and so for years even after the child has left the home, you'll find that a parent, or especially mothers, will cry and cry and cry and apologize and apologize and apologize. And so many times the narratives of these women, and yeah, primarily women, when I interviewed the mothers, it was at the point where they were like, I don't even know what I'm apologizing for. I don't even know what I'm saying sorry for. And for me, this is a whole other area of ambiguous loss that is my next area I'm going to look into there. But this idea of apologizing, if only I had done this, if only I had done that. One mother reported feeling an overwhelming sense of owing someone contrition for the abuse she was experiencing. Think about that. At the state that they would get in. Messages such as, if only I had. Sometimes you'll hear your own parents saying that. If only I'd held them more as a baby. If only I had not worked. If only I had done this or done that. And so what happens is that people in this apologizing stage, what they're really looking for is a way to find a fixable cause, and they couldn't find it, and they're sorry they couldn't find it. And then without realizing that professionals have yet to be able to find it as well. But taking that responsibility on. Humor, self-explanatory. What's interesting though, it's dark humor. It's not like ha-ha humor. It's like, well, when I wake up dead, a mother would often report, well, when I wake up dead, because her son would threaten her at night when she would go to sleep to kill her or slit her throat while she was sleeping. Or if I lived through these teenage years to avoid conveying the seriousness of the situation. Or even when they were facing thousands of dollars, a lot of times these kids will destroy homes. Like take a bat, one kid took a bat and broke every single window in the house just to do it. And so thousands of dollars that go, and parents would say, such as, well, it could have been worse, it could have been my head. And so this is this idea of that dark humor of trying to always find the better side of it. Or if a room was destroyed, I said, well, I was going to redecorate this room anyway. And really think about that. These kids many times for emotional abuse will target things that are very dear to a parent and then destroy that. Blaming comes into play. What's interesting is that when they blame, they're blaming themselves. This is a negative outcome for stigma. This whole idea of blaming. You know what? But then they'll add to the end of it, but you know what? They'll blame themselves for understanding there's something they should be able to do to prevent this abuse, even though if they could stop it, they would. But they can't, so then they'll say, okay, but you know what? Until you walked in my shoes, until you've really understood what I'm going through, one, I'll take the blame, but on the other hand, don't blame me. I'm doing the best I can. So some of that comes into play. And then obviously, as I referred to before, this idea of isolation and bonding with others. Either people will isolate themselves totally, I already referred to that, or they will bond with someone who they know is going through the same thing. So that's the first category, the first quadrant. The second one becomes accepting stigma. We accept the stigma, but they avoid the identification of it. If that makes sense. They know that this is their stigma, but they're not going to put themselves out there and say, hey, I'm an abused parent. And they refuse to accept it for what it is many times. So they're in a sense of denial. But this idea, the quote is, yes, but my situation is different. You have an abusive child, your child's on it, and I'm an abused parent, but my situation is different. And some of the differences they identify are drugs, alcohol, unemployment of the spouse, or whatever the case may be. Ways that they do this as they go and do this is, one is that they conceal things. They will say things such as, well, that's to be accepted during the teenage years. So they're acknowledging that the abuse occurs, but they're concealing the severity of it. So they know, like, well, he pushed me and I got a bruise. Or they'll say, well, I got a bruise, I fell down. And they won't say it's from their adolescence. So they're concealing things on a number of different levels. The other one is that this idea of distancing themselves from it. And this is where an adolescent, parents will physically distance themselves from their adolescents. And this works a lot better for fathers than it does for mothers. Because mothers are still primarily responsible for the home, the children, getting everybody ready, even though that's changing, that's good. But right now, that's still how it goes. One father, and this really hurts my heart when I hear this, one father reported he would get up so early in the morning before the teen would ever get up. And he would leave the house to go to work so he wouldn't have to deal with this situation. And he'd come home way after dark so he wouldn't have to deal with this situation. So basically what he was doing was he was distancing himself from the teen, but he ended up distancing himself from his whole family. And you hear this many times, again, with qualitative research, it's saturation. You hear the same stories over and over. This guy said he reported working so hard at distancing himself from his emotions regarding his son's abuse and the impact it was having on his family and his inability to prevent it, that he distanced himself from his wife and other children. And he said, although this helped him deal with the stigma, what happened was he had an inability to recover and get back the emotional distance that he had created with his family during these 7 years. Think about that. All of a sudden your child's gone, he's done abusing, and you've emotionally distanced yourself for maybe of the 7 years, 4 to 7 years. And then trying to get that back. That family didn't survive. That one didn't survive. Reframing comes into play, and this is where a strategic approach is where they make favorable comparisons to something. They'll compare themselves between themselves and others, saying, well, the other thing that they'll say is, this child isn't meaning to hurt me. If he really wanted to hurt me, he would have hurt me. And so they'll reframe the whole incident oftentimes. Well, he didn't mean to jump off and kick the dog just happened to get in the way. Or the child, or my foot just happened to get in the way, or my arm, or whatever the case may be. So oftentimes they'll make favorable comparisons, and they'll always end up saying things such as, yeah, but he's such a good kid. He's so smart. He's so sweet. He's so nice. And yet, he's abusing me. So they reframe the whole situation about what's taking place. The third quadrant is called evading responsibility and reducing offensiveness. And this one has to do with the saying that goes with it, is until you walk in my shoes. And when we look at this idea of evading responsibility, this is really to argue against the perception that these parents could stop the abuse if they wanted to. And they can't. And so therefore this whole idea is evading responsibility, trying to actively deal with the situation to prevent the abuse from occurring, and that's very difficult for them to do. So what they'll do is they'll have provocation, and I want to get through some of this so we can talk. Unintentionality, they may unintentionally disavow it by just not saying it happens or coming up with a different idea it's happened or a different reason it's happening. They'll reduce the offensiveness, and minimization is a huge one right here for dealing with the strategies of stigma with adolescent to abuse. Parents who are abused by their adolescents. Minimization happens when abused parents have They practice this to outsiders. In fact, so many times, and I find this very interesting, many abusive teens are described by parents and others as smart, personable, highly interpersonally competent with those they engage. And so as a result, what happens, because they've done so much minimizing, when other people will find out what these children are doing, they can't believe it. They would never have guessed it. Because much like with other types of abusers, they have one face out here and they have another face back there. And don't forget, there's the honeymoon periods. You have the escalations, you know, the triggers, the escalation, and then the honeymoon, and then it starts all over again, for those of you who've studied abuse. So these types of things come into play. And the last one is the last quadrant, and to me this is the quadrant that's probably a little more problematic, and Jesse and I are still trying to work this one through. It's challenging and denying the stigma. This strategy here is the strategy that if people would embrace this, as far as dealing with stigma, I think could begin to change the stigma. And what this is that if you really understood, you wouldn't be so quick to judge. And the way that they approach this one is, one, they openly deny others' understanding of adolescent parent abuse. They'll challenge that person. Somebody will say, well, they'll tell a story about a child, and maybe their own, but they won't admit that at this point. And they'll say this child, and then somebody will say something negative, and then they'll challenge that. You know, that's really an uneducated thing to say. Or, you know what? That really doesn't, if you knew the situation, you might have a different conclusion to it. And that challenging is where then people have to stop and think, and that's where the discussions begin to take place about what adolescent to parent abuse is and what these parents are going through. And so this idea of openly denying others, again, very hard to get parents to do because of the very strong societal norms of what it means to be a good parent and how much we're tied up in that. They'll deny the stigma itself. They'll either openly deny, well, by that meaning the understanding others have of it, and they'll discredit the discreditors. So those people who say, well, those parents are bad parents, then they will discredit them, like as I just previously said as well, on a number of different levels with education. Or I know that person sought out 9 counselors, they still weren't able to get help, things such as that. So they actually end up discrediting the discreditors. They actually end up stigmatizing the stigmatizers, saying you have no understanding. The logical denial comes in and takes place, and this is where they ignore statements about being a bad parent or people who are, and then they will offer explanations of the abuse. They'll try to explain what is happening from as much research as they know. What you find about abused parents is that they are some of the most well-researched parents around. They probably teach parenting classes, because many times in my sample, because they were all intact families, they're working so hard to try to figure out what's going on. So this idea of logical denial, and then providing the evidence info. They will say, well, I know a person as well who's experiencing this. Again, telling you about a situation they know, a first-hand experience, although the person they're telling doesn't know that. And then they're able to get rid of some of the myths and make people begin to understand what it is that they're going through. So when we look at stigma of adolescents who abuse their parents, both denial and reducing strategies can be seen as proactive. And so the real thing comes in, or the real approach to this becomes to realize, okay, so if this is our area of research, and as I talk to many of my students about, is that if you're going to be a claims maker, then what do you have to do to begin to eliminate the stigma? And this is an actual practical approach based on Meisenbach. She's just starting to get out there with it. But again, changing the public understanding takes someone to stand for it. It takes an avant-garde. It takes a claims maker in order to make a difference in these parents' lives. In the conclusion, it's a great step in educating others, this model. And say, you know, here's happening with these parents. Here's what's going on in order for people to understand it. And then the sad part of this whole problem is that rather than fight the stigma, parents, rather than fight the stigma, they'll just silence themselves. And that's not helping the problem unless some of us open up and begin to talk about the situation. Questions? That's a lot. I could talk days and days on this issue. So, questions? Yeah?
Nancy, what happens when a parent fears for their siblings, the other siblings in the family, and finally decides to call the police or something? Do the police disbelieve them, or?
Now, what's interesting, what people a lot of times don't realize is that with adolescent parent abuse, these kids aren't abusing their siblings, they're abusing their parents. And that's the adolescent parent, and primarily it's the mother.
So usually the siblings are not involved at all? So
No, because, and that comes to obviously some other process research, but what happens is that many times parents, once the abuse, they look at the triggers that are happening. It's kind of like an abused woman would do. If I think my husband's going to be abusive to me, I see the triggers, I'm going to get my kids out of the way so that they're not the ones involved in it. And you see parents doing this exact same way, which when I interviewed the siblings, you know, developed issues of withdrawal, avoiding conflict, things such as that. There has come a point, and of the families I did, there were 2 families where they said one of the other brothers, there were brothers in both families, when they finally got to an age they felt big enough to hold their own against this other person, then the child, the other sibling, would defend the mother and step up. But it was not as if that child went after the other siblings. That's not what happens.
But I could see it feeling like it was such a scary environment. I mean, breaking windows out of the house and having the siblings witness the abuse of it. You'd think that for the sake of the kids, they might call the police.
Well, they do call police. They do call the police, but that's also where the minimization is going on. This idea of, well, that's just a typical teenage type behavior.
So that's what the police say when they're...
Oh, no. Depending on the police, they will, usually they separate them, much like with any other abusive situation. They'll separate them, and then they'll get their story, they'll cool everybody down. But again, it's a bit of a different situation because they won't take the child out of the home like they would possibly do with an abusive man or abusive woman. They won't take the child out of the home because the child stays in the home. And also, the people my sample was, I tried to keep them as close as possible. They were all middle-aged, you know, probably mid to upper level classes. And so every time they removed a child from the home, not only did they have the stigma of a small town type local whatever, they had to pay all the fees. They had to pay the jail fees and the transportation fee and the call fees because people don't realize that you pay for the legal system to put your kids in jail or whatever the case may be. It's really a tough situation for these parents. And the other thing to realize that usually one child is, I only met one family that had 3 children who were abusive, but everybody had one child. They didn't have 2 or 3 or 4, except that one family, which there were some anomalies there.
You mentioned that like most go to an average of 9 to 16 counselors. So I'm wondering if you have any ideas as to why it's so ineffective counseling process.
Yeah.
I mean, I know family systems are very complex. You have to look at the whole system in order to understand why it's apparently.
There's a couple of different reasons, but first of all, I would say there's who's that guy we went and did a documentary
Detroit?
In Detroit. There's a guy in Detroit who he's specializing in this area where he's actually doing the treatment of it now. And I asked him those questions, and he said one of the reasons is that you know a Hillary statement, it takes a community to raise a child, or a village. It takes a village to raise a child. I can't even get my quote. He said he has found the only effective way to do it because, again, if you look at the description I gave you of those kids, they come across as smart, intelligent, they're involved in schools. It's not like we're looking at juvenile delinquents, even though they probably are, but they're not according to society. So he engages the coach, and he engages the clerical person. He engages somebody in every area of that kid's life that kid wants to do or be involved in. And then that other person says, okay, I'm going to hold accountable. If you abuse your mother again, then you're not going to be playing. You will be on the team, but you will not play. So they're able to get some support from the village that they live in. It went so far as to, I'm trying to remember his name.
I can't think of it either.
I'm drawing a blank. But anyway, what he said one time he actually hired a karate guy, black belt. He hired a black belt to go and stay in the home. Because the mother, you have to realize that when people who abuse, there's usually a power differential of some sort, and usually it's mothers, and usually the sons are bigger and stronger than a mother. So he actually hired somebody for a while to be, that's how they worked through trying to create new patterns and processes of expressing frustration or whatever it is they were doing. So that's the only positive I've heard so far. There's places in Australia that are really working on this, Gallagher and some of those guys. But there's no answers, and that's the problem right now. But there's no answers for wife abuse or child abuse, other than how do we keep them safe at this point?
No, I apologize for answering it from this, but what are some of your hypotheses of the causal case?
What is the way?
Some of your hypotheses of the causal case, what's causing?
See, that's the question that everybody always asks. In fact, most of the studies, I'm a communication, so relational communication, so I look at the process, the communicative processes. Most people would look at the socioeconomic type of situations, like what is the education, what is the class, are there drugs involved, what is the socioeconomics, psychological issues, physiological issues in the child. So those are the things where many of the studies have been done, but there really is no one thing that they have identified. Gallagher says in Australia, which is very intriguing, he said it has to do with the spirit, not spirit of entitlement, the theory of entitlement, the entitlement theory, where these kids are so entitled that they feel that these parents owe them, that they don't give them, they take it. You know, that's one theory. That's his theory. But as far as what's the cause, yet to be determined. Now, with the process is another article I did. That's a book chapter. Is that when I did my research, there's two different patterns that emerged. One was the asking pattern. One was the requesting pattern. When parents asked their kids to do something was when they could prevent physical and emotional abuse. But when kids asked their parents to do something and parents said no, that was when oftentimes it developed into physical abuse. So what you see there is somebody's controlling that communicative pattern. Parents are saying, okay, I'm not going to push this, but kids are pushing. And parents are trying to be good parents and not give in. So actually it's the good parents who don't give in are the ones who often end up being abused, who have the rules and the structures, and then by this last year or so, they're just exhausted. And they just want to survive. Other questions?
So is that considered a trigger then, like when kids request something of their parents, and then also what would other triggers, are there other known triggers that are common between all these families?
The main one that, again, depending on the process of communication, the trigger becomes for the actual abuse is, I ask you to do something. It's not that I just come home as a child and I blow up and I attack you. There's some sort of communication that has taken place. And so some people will say, well, it really is a power type of issue. But when you look at the findings of the type of conflict styles, it's actually opposite. I tell my classes is that parents who compete with these types of kids have less abuse than parents who try to collaborate. Because parents who try to collaborate, I don't know this, but I think kids see that as a weakness in their parents versus a strong. So it all has to do with this communication process of, I want to do something, you say no, and it goes from there.
So boundaries, setting boundaries as a parent very early. Mm-hmm. You set a boundary at 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old, 6 years old, then you establish a pattern of behavior. Mm-hmm. And if you try and collaborate, just try and collaborate with a 2-year-old.
Right.
Or a 3-year-old,
yeah.
Or a 4-year-old.
Yeah.
So if there is a pattern of collaboration, that would be interesting to look at.
Well, I was thinking collaboration as they reach those teenage years.
Yes, but I'm saying that the collaboration pattern could be set very early.
It's interesting. They collaborate with a 2-year-old, 3-year-old.
You can.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
So Nancy, there's quite a bit of research and writing right now about elder abuse.
Right.
And I'm wondering, and that's becoming quite a popular topic to look at. So I'm wondering, have you run across anything that shows a connection? That if a teenager abuses a mother, say in the high school,
right,
is there a connection that same adult male will abuse the same mother?
Yeah, most likely not, because these kids really do, and they really do stop once they're 18. And if they don't, and usually what happens, I should say usually, many times these kids will call parents, I don't want to say they grow up, but they begin to understand what they've done, and they try to repair relationships. Now, are there boys who are abusing their elderly mothers or fathers, whatever? Yes, and have they been abusive as adolescents? I don't know. But even people who are doing wife abuse are wondering if this is the missing link. I would argue no. I think this is something different.
Okay.
I think it's, I don't know that, but I strongly would suspect it's something different. Because these kids oftentimes are very well behaved until they hit the age of like 9 or 10. And then it's at 11 when most of this abuse starts, very gradually. And then it either escalates or it stops. Usually girls will stop, boys will continue to escalate. Again, that has to do with the size factor and some of those types of issues. There's so much to it that it's so hard. Yeah.
So you're talking about collaboration and things like that. What about family systems that change? You know, when a family system changes, is there any correlation between that and then a child, you know, starting to exhibit these behaviors? Or do you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. If you look up in Canada, Cottrell's doing, she does her research just with that issue itself on kids who abuse. And a lot of times that will happen when a parent separates, and usually the mother is the one that gets custody. Many times then a child who wasn't abusive, predominantly male, will then begin to abuse the mothers. But there's different samples. I mean, that's a different sample, but yeah, that has been proven.
So in blended families, are they saying, is parent abuse a problem in a blended family?
I haven't seen research on that one. I've seen it on single. I've seen, my research has been on intact, but I have not seen blended. That's an interesting, that would be very interesting. Yeah.
You know mine. It's her job.
As far as looking at, like, in the research, was there any connection between, like, what made a parent fall into a certain quadrant as far as stigma management? So if the fourth quadrant is the one where they're able to reverse the stigma a little bit, was there factors that played into that falling into that, or did you see any correlation?
Actually, what I saw was that during the actual episodes, while they were still in the home experiencing it, it wasn't until after the children had left that a lot of times they could handle this last quadrant, because all their energy and everything was being invested in trying to prevent the abuse. But later, as they look back, they're able to they start to feel freer about speaking about it. And I think that's the key, is, you know, is this fancy quadrant, but I really think it's at what point are they able to begin to talk about it. Some 2, 3, 4 years later are still doing the apologizing, like I talked about previously. So many factors.
The issue of forgiveness would be interesting to look at.
Yeah, very interesting to look at. One last tip, because I know we have to go, but interesting is that many times the kids do not think they're actually abusing their parents. They don't view it as abuse. And when you tell Gallagher in Australia, they do this narrative type of treatment, and so what they do is that they have them tell the narrative, and then they have the parent tell the narrative, and they never agree, so they have the kid keep repeating that narrative until he or she understands what that parent's narrative is. But it takes weeks and weeks and weeks. It's not like it just would happen like we would think. They just don't think they're hurting their parents. And plus, their parents can take it because their parents love them. See? Research out there, guys. Go for it, huh?
Kids minimum.
Amen, yeah.